Hey, it's DA and welcome to Techtonica. Did you know that aside from making infinite bio rigs like you can see my facility over here doing, there's also a way to make infinite iron ingots and copper ingots? And no, I don't mean by using the miners, because as you can see over here, the veins do actually run out. No, I mean infinite iron ingots and copper ingots without any interference from you required after you set it up. The secret to all of this is the thresher, because even though you mostly use it for Atlantum ore and the plant materials, you can actually also use this to recycle your building. So let's say I throw in some of these storage boxes, I get some of the materials back that I used to make these. Now normally, of course, that is not a net gain. You're not going to get as many materials back as you put in, let alone make a profit on that. But there are actually a couple of exceptions to that. Specifically, the power floors yield 1 copper bar each, as you can see, and the conveyor belts actually gain us 1 iron ore or iron ingot back each. Now, if we make full use of that, we can actually make a system that gives us a net production of copper and iron without us having to do anything other than supplying it with power. Now, in order to make this work, we're actually going to need 2 assemblers, at least on this side. We're going to need one making the actual power floors, which are made from ingots as well as copper wire, which also means we're going to be making the copper wire right next door. Now, as you notice, all of this actually just requires copper ingots and iron ingots as well, which we're going to be making in this build, so that is going to be completely self-sufficient. Similarly, on the other side, we're going to be making the Mark I belts, which need the mechanical components, which again we're going to be making right next door. Now let's do the math on this for a second, because I really need you to understand how powerful this is. It takes 1 copper ingot to make 8 wires. Those 8 wires can be turned into 80 times 10 power floors, because it only takes 1 wire to make these 10 power floors. These 80 power floors are then going to turn back into 80 copper ingots. So by spending 1 ingot, we're going to get 79 ingots back. Now that is ignoring for a moment the copper ingots, but we'll get to that in a second. Because on the other side we are making mechanical components, it takes 3 ingots to make 4 mechanical components, and then in order to make conveyor belts we need 3 of those mechanical components, so we actually have 1 mechanical component left over from running the other recipe once, and that will get us 10 conveyor belts. Now these 10 conveyor belts are going to be turned into a total of 10 iron ingots, and if you look at this math, we took 3 ingots to make that stuff, and we even have mechanical components left over, and we're getting 10 in return, so that's over 7 iron ingots in terms of profit. Which means that if we're running both of these machines just a few times, we're going to be netting a net gain of copper ingots on the right hand side and a net gain of iron ingots on the other hand side. So how do we make sure these are actually supplying each other and we ensure these keep running infinitely without us having to interfere? The answer is, of course, circular belts. So we're going to be putting iron ingots on the belt over here, we're going to be putting copper ingots on the belt over here, and then this belt through the middle will have a mix of both, spitting out a mix of both to each of these sides. Then the filter inserters are going to be picking up the required materials from those belts into these machines, and those will be producing either the belts or the power floors, and those will be turned into even more ingots, which are going to be put right back on the belt. Now, before you start celebrating, there's actually a couple of issues with this build that you do need to fix, otherwise it won't keep running by itself. For example, because we're putting 1 item on this belt and 1 item on the other one, and we are combining them into a single belt, what you'll often see is that you actually get alternating iron and copper on this middle belt. If this is exactly alternating, that means we'll get only ingots of one type on one side and only ingots of the other type being spit out on the other belt, because it's actually alternating the outputs as well. Now, in order to fix that, there's a couple of small fixes you can do. Now, the first fix that you can actually make is putting in these inserters with these tiny little side belts on here as well. All this does is just have something kind of to upset the system. These inserters will draw things off the middle belt and actually just put it right back on one of the side belts again. But because that kind of messes up the alternating pattern, that will ensure that you get some of each on both of these sides. Now, in theory, this problem could still persist even with these inserters in place, so to make sure we are 100% sure we fixed the problem, we can actually put some boxes down here. So what I'm doing here, I'm basically drawing some of the materials off this belt, because again, we're going to be overproducing these ingots and we want to use them elsewhere. So we're going to put those ingots on a belt over here, put them in the box, and then put some of these back on a belt that combines in the middle. Now we have 3 sources of inputs being collected in a single node, and that means that we should never get an fixed pattern in here. That's very, very, very unlikely. I guess in theory it's still possible, but I haven't seen it happen ever. So this basically fixes the problem, and on the upside we also have a way to feed our system, because we do have to kind of jumpstart our system over here. Now there is one last but important trick that I'm using here in order to make sure this runs smoothly, and that is that I'm putting in the iron ingots on the side that we're actually producing the copper, and vice versa. And I'll show you why in a moment, but let me just show you how this is actually working. So as you can see, we are putting in a pretty random amount of stuff on both sides. This is going to go right into the machines, and these will start producing very quickly and early on. As you can see, we have the wiring coming, and we should be producing the mechanical components really quickly as well. There you go, this is the build entirely up and running, and let's check the boxes. As you can see, I'm already way over what I put back in. That's not even counting everything that's still on the belts on both sides. So I have about 50 spare ingots in each of these boxes, and that is again not counting what's still on the belt. So a net profit without me actually putting anything in from the outside other than the initial seed. Now getting back to why am I collecting the copper on the side of where we're producing the iron, that is actually to ensure that there is always going to be iron in the system. Basically what I'm doing, I'm clearing out the copper from the system on this side, so this is going to be pure iron going in, and on the other side I'm doing the reverse, so this ensures that there's only copper going into the system. That way this build should never be able to come to a standstill other than the boxes being full. But of course you're not supposed to just collect stuff in these boxes, you're actually supposed to use them for something as well. And as long as you keep these inserters over here, it should be impossible. You can even actually take these inserters out most likely, but it should be pretty much impossible for this build to ever come to a standstill as long as you're not collecting any resources from the inner side of these belts. If you're collecting them from the outside, on the side which you're not actually producing those resources, you're guaranteeing that you're only siphoning off the excess amount of stuff that's not actually used to keep the build running. So, infinite resources, and you never have to mine copper or iron again. Of course, you will probably have to replicate this build several times over in order to get enough resources compared to what you actually need to build all the stuff in the game. But this is a way to make sure you don't have to worry about those miners ever again, at least not the copper or iron version. As far as I know, it's not possible to do this with limestone or atlantum, so you're going to need to build some drills anyway, but it's definitely a step in the good direction. Now, there's a couple of last things I want to note. As you can see, this build is not 100% optimal. I do like the simplicity of this build, so that's why I'm showing you this design. Specifically, what you could do is, because you get way more copper than you need, you can actually replicate this build on this side as well. Maybe expand it, maybe add in like 3 or 4 more threshers on one side. Make sure you're actually using all those copper and then just collect it straight from the belt. Again, just leaving a single one intact will ensure that this build keeps running. At the same time, you might also want to replicate the iron side a few times, mainly to make sure you get enough production, because this is by far the lowest production. This side is actually easily able to keep up with the amount of belts you're producing on this side. Well, as you can see on this side, the power floors are actually not being consumed at the same speed the thresher can handle them. It's not a perfectly balanced build, but it's a very simple one that you can replicate as easily as possible. And if you want, you can just optimize it further and get even more bang for your buck. And remember that once you have this set up, you can actually make any item that is dependent on either iron or copper from this build as well. which includes a lot of things. But if you combine this with the infinite biobrick build that's producing basically infinite plant matter as well as limestone, you can actually make almost any item in the game that doesn't rely on Atlantium ore without any interference whatsoever. So let's say take processor units, for example. You'll need plant matter frames, which are coming out of the infinite biobrick build as well. You only need a tiny little bit of the plant matter that you're making in that build to actually fuel the smelter, and the smelter is used to make limestone from the kindle vine extract that you're making in that build. So you also have infinite limestone. It's not going to be a huge amount, but if you're not using the limestone to make biobricks, but you're just using that build to make plant matter frames and things like that, you're going to have a lot of limestone left over to use for whatever you want. Now, I don't know if this is an intentional design, so it might be patched out in the future, but I hope you enjoy it while it lasts. If you found it useful, make sure that you like and subscribe, and I hope to catch you in the next one.